So I'm going to ask you, what does insolvent mean?
Age-old question, $64 million question. Well, insolvent means you're not solvent. That's what the Act tells us, isn't it?
Yep, Section 95.
Um,
So straightforward.
it's a
Do you
simple.
get asked this question by company directors or individuals who are looking at bankruptcy?
Yeah, we do a lot. We have a lot of concern with people who are concerned whether or not they're trading whilst insolvent.
Yeah.
So they really want to understand, what does that mean? What does it mean to be insolvent or solvent, and what do people look at? And obviously, my love is to go to the water wheel case with the all the indicia of insolvency, which seems so straightforward, but we have it all listed out there in a case. But just to be sort of quite brief about it, when you can't pay your debts, as and when they fall due, then you're insolvent. Now, that doesn't mean that your company doesn't have enough assets to pay your debts. You might be asset rich, you might be cash poor. And there are a number of different things that everyone needs to look at in terms of, well, how do we know if we're insolvent or not? You might have the ability to pay, but you don't pay. And that's one that we've come across sometimes as well. It's like, well, they are actually solvent. The fact that they don't want to pay is very different to the fact that they can't pay. So what we look at a lot of the time is whether or not there's also access to funds to be able to pay the debt. So we see a lot of companies that might actually be struggling, and many businesses, as we know, struggle for cash in early years. But they are supported either by their holding companies or by their directors and shareholders who have access to funds that do inject those funds. And I often suggest that before injecting those funds, they would come and see someone like you, Stace, to make sure that that's being done in the most appropriate way that they can.
Secured, perhaps?
Perhaps. But what that means is that the company can still pay its debts, even if it's not from its own, its cash reserves. So it's really about that liquidity, isn't it? It's whether or not a company can pay its debts as and when they fall due. And I think that phrase there is the most important.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the reason why tens of thousands of dollars can get spent in legal fees trying to determine this issue before a court is that it's more than just that simple question, can you pay your debts as and when they fall due? You then have to provide evidence of those other funds being available and on what terms or conditions attached. And it's actually quite a complex issue that you would need to evidence to the court whether you were, or if you're acting for a liquidator or you are the liquidator, producing that solvency report to try and pin down the actual date that the company was insolvent, because that date is extremely important for a lot of those voidable transactions that a liquidator may or may not be able to pursue under the Corporations Act should the need arise.
I think the other part of that is that as and when they fall due, it's not actually that easy to ascertain when a debt's due. Sometimes you might be liable for a debt like say a lease. You know, you're liable for the ongoing payment of the lease. You're actually liable for the whole lease. You know, a few things taken into account there. But at what point does that crystallize? And at what point, are you no longer able to pay it when you may have otherwise been able to pay the individual payments? And I think tax office debt is sometimes, a clincher here, because a lot of businesses don't realise, sometimes the debt's due before they've even made the lodgements because of timing, that happens. So I think it's really important and quite unclear sometimes to try and figure out that, when is something due?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the lesson learned here is that if someone wants to ask you a simple question, just be ready to tell them it's not that simple.
That's right, exactly.